Well, hello, international marketing students. Thank you for being flexible. Um, I had intended to provide this lecture for tomorrow, January 20th, live. However, our flight from California was rebooked, and unfortunately, it prevented me from doing this lecture live. So, um, please note that I will be checking on Thursday to validate that you watched this lecture. And again, just appreciate your flexibility. All right, so with that, I'm gonna make the screen a little bit bigger here. All right, so this is just an update on the top three selections that each one of you have determined is your um, country that you want to study. It looks like I'm still missing several. And so remember, tomorrow, Tuesday, is the deadline to submit those top three to me. Okay. All right. Um, all right. So this chapter, chapter three, is providing, some really good underpinnings of history and geography of different countries around the world, and just recognizing that both countries' history and their geography, different types of ethnicities, um, and races and beliefs and customs, all of those elements become or are factors into developing, excuse me, what is the notion of a culture for each one of those countries. And so it's important for us to have an understanding of how those cultures were developed. So, a bit of a historical perspective. History defines a nation's mission. I think the biggest thing that I would say here in this first bullet is that history influences significantly how a country perceives itself and its neighbors. So, for example, if you're a country that has been historically dominated by another country, for whatever reason, you might have been enslaved over the centuries. Um, you might have been taken advantage of in a variety of ways. We shouldn't be surprised when that country is a little bit um, fearful or a little wary of its geographic neighbors. And so, again, if we translate it to a marketing perspective, we have to put ourselves in that other culture's shoes. Remember, we talked in our last lecture about being cognizant of our self-reference criterion, that we want to be able to put ourselves and see the world through another culture's perspective. And so this is certainly an example of how a different culture's view of the world, its subjective view of the world, is influenced by its historical interactions with other countries and other cultures. How does that get manifested? Well, it gets manifested in number two, attitudes about the role of government and business. One of the authors that we talked about is Hofstede, and different cultures, as he noted, documented, have a very different understanding of power dynamics, um, which different levels of management are attended to by some more subordinates in a different way. Their understanding of what is there as a subordinate, their ability to question or challenge authority. And so we have to be cognizant of that. Um, excuse me. Now, several of you had selected Japan as one of your top three selections. Um, so one of you will end up having that selection, and I haven't made that determination yet. But um, Japan is an example, of course, you can see here, 7 centuries under a feudal system. So a very defined power structure based upon the shogun sort of philosophy. They didn't really have, as we understand it, any uh, interaction with the outside world until the mid 1900s. So you can imagine the shock when a white man shows up in a culture that has probably never seen anyone that looked like this person. You could imagine what a strange situation that would be. Um, so, they historically, the Japanese have been dominated by colonial powers. Um, they've certainly had um, a, a very difficult relationship with China for centuries. And so, in general, there is not necessarily a warm, fuzzy feeling that the Japanese would have toward the Chinese. Um, and so because they'd been dominated by the Chinese for centuries. Um, of course, in our most recent history with Japan, um, w- hopefully all of you learned um, in civics class or world history in high school that in December of 1941, the Japanese attacked the U.S. at Pearl Harbor in Oahu. And while it was by no means an easy war between the Allies and the Axis powers, particularly in the Western theater in Japan, I think hopefully you all recognize how that war in the Pacific ended by the U.S. dropping two nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Um, Obviously, a very dark time in history for the U.S. and for Japan. And but that being said, certainly it was a humiliating defeat for the Japanese. One thing that isn't on this slide that I would point you to, was a gentleman by the name of Edwards Deming. I would encourage you to read about him. In about 2 sentences, what I would say is Deming was an expert in um, basically production processes. And it's interesting when you read about Demings, he went to U.S. auto companies, U.S. manufacturing companies, and tried to get executives in those U.S. companies to recognize the inefficiencies in their current manufacturing processes. And he was rebuffed. And so after World War II, Demings did, he went to Japan and trained up thousands of Japanese engineers who were eager to hear what he knew about manufacturing processes. And, fast forward to 1980s and 90s, Toyota and Honda started eating U.S. manufacturers, auto manufacturers for lunch. Um, so it's an interesting sort of rise of the Japanese economy post World War II. And it's interesting that Deming, an American, basically took his show overseas to Japan and created, from a U.S. auto perspective, an extremely uh, um, fierce competitors in in Honda, in Toyota, and many other companies and manufacturers. One of the things that I want to point out, and we touched on earlier, is that history is subjective. There's this quote that I love. It's often attributed to Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of uh, Great Britain in the World War II time period. Um, anyway, the quote is, "History is written by the victors." So, really, the takeaway from this is, by definition, history is subjective because it is the winners of a battle that end up writing what happened. So, I think there are certainly um, uh, novels and books and articles that have been written by um, the quote unquote losing countries. And let's say in World War II, we might say Japan, we might say Nazi Germany, who have a very different perspective of their historical experience relative to World War II based upon their defeat in World War II. So that's something important for us to remember is the fact that history is indeed subjective. Again, this is sort of U.S. civics kind of material that you probably would have learned in high school. But you can see as we move from east to west that we can certainly recognize the 13 colonies in the eastern seaboard. And then after, um, we can recognize the American Revolution and these um, after the U.S. won its independence in the Revolutionary War, those colonies became states, each with their own um, legislative processes, their own constitutions, and so on. But as we move forward in time, you can see the expansion into Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and so on. In 1803, again, you probably uh, learned in high school the notion of the Louisiana Purchase and all of these, and this lighter blue that the U.S. acquired. And then certainly in the uh, mid to late 1800s, the Western states, and then here, most recently, or at least in the lower 48 states, Arizona, New Mexico. Um, One thing I don't see here, which is interesting, is the late additions of Hawaii way out here, and then Alaska. So those happened certainly later than what's depicted here. So, so one of the interesting topics that we want to hit on, and the reason why I say it's interesting is because this idea, the notion of the Monroe Doctrine, has come to the fore here fairly recently with some of the actions that the U.S. has taken relative to Venezuela and some of the rhetoric around Canada, and then most recently, Greenland. So the idea of the Monroe Doctrine, I'm going to start down here, is this notion from President Monroe that basically he drew a quote unquote line in the ocean and around uh, the Western Hemisphere that said no further European colonization in the New World. So he was basically putting up borders or boundaries and said, you know, the United States basically is the dominant power in the Western Hemisphere, and we're going to make sure that it stays that way. I'm not going to make a value judgment on that, but the reason why it's important to talk about that now is, again, the recent U.S. actions in Venezuela, in Panama, with the Panama Canal being, uh, at least certainly the discussion and maybe the actual event, the Panama Canal returning back to ownership to the United States. Um, Now, if we go up here and talk about manifest destiny, this is, of course, a fairly controversial topic. I don't really feel uh, confident in taking an authoritarian position on this, but be that as it may, the notion of manifest destiny was prevalent in certainly in the 19th century, and the idea is that Americans were a chosen people ordained by God to create a model society. Um, Obviously, fairly controversial. Um, and again, I'm not a theologian and I'm not a historian, so I'm not going to really make any uh, uh, pronouncements here other than to just recognize that this idea of manifest destiny drove a lot of the decision making in the 19th century. And then here, as the author talks about, justify the annexation of Texas, Oregon, New Mexico, California, and then, of course, involvement in Cuba, Alaska, Hawaii, and the Philippines. So whether it was good or whether it was bad, um, the idea is that we, as a nation at that time, felt compelled to conquer different territories because we felt like that was our divine mission. All right, so you know, when we sort of couple um, the fact, and going back a little bit, we couple the idea that history colors the way that a nation, um, its attitudes toward other countries, then we can certainly see how this notion of manifest destiny and the Monroe Doctrine explains a lot of what other, the US and Japan and certainly other nations, particularly Europe, and their decision making and cultural development over the last 150 years. There is a YouTube here that I don't necessarily want to take the time to watch uh, here in this recorded lecture, but I would encourage you as you look at these slides and look at this recording posted in Discovery, it's worth a look to review this notion of a Donroe doctrine, which is I don't know if it's I don't know how to characterize it, but it's a play on words where Donald Trump, being the U.S. president, is sort of re asserting this Monroe Doctrine in in the Western Hemisphere. And so this YouTube link um, goes through at least one person's portrayal of what this Donroe Doctrine is. Now, there's another uh, sort of, well, it's called the Theodore Roosevelt Corollary. It's again sort of this philosophical approach to U.S. Involvement in the rest of the world. The Theodore Roosevelt Corollary in the early 1900s and the early 20th century um, prohibits non-American intervention in Latin American affairs. Um, and so here you can see how did this notion of the Theodore Roosevelt corollary get manifested? Well, it got manifested in particular, the Panama Canal in 1903, and then uh, Cuba was forced to accept the formation of a provisional government. Of course, since then, of course, Cuba is a socialist communist um, country run by Fidel Castro and his family. And so it's been, I guess one could argue, a thorn in the US's side for decades. And kind of going further, if you recall, in the 1960s, President JFK having to deal with what has now been character or called the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the Soviets placed uh, ICB, and I believe they were intercontinental ballistic missiles in Cuba pointed at the US, and almost in the early 1960s caused um, uh, military conflict between the US and the Soviet Union. So, um, sort of zooming out, what the big takeaway is that this idea, the Monroe Doctrine, or now sort of the Donroe Doctrine, is driving a lot of the foreign policy that you would see even today in the US. I won't read through this entire list, but again, these are sort of evidence or manifestations of U.S. involvement in Latin America relative to sort of, again, this imposition of the Monroe Doctrine in South America. All right. Now, th this is kind of interesting when we think about geography, and you might think, well, what does geography have to do with international marketing? Well, obviously, the sort of the topography of a country, what is its climate? Um, what is it mountainous? Is it flat? Is it rainy? Is it dry? All of those um, elements that we think about a particular geography, those influence how society within that country, its culture and economy are affected, trying to meet its people's needs. So, for example, you could imagine that if a country is lacking in raw materials and resources, then their ability to feed and clothe their citizens of that country is going to be likely limited, and therefore they're going to be more dependent upon global trade, um, and it will be much more difficult for them to uh, isolate themselves and then just try to meet its society's needs without other government's intervention. So, what are some of the elements around climate and topography, altitude, humidity, temperature, different seasons? Obviously, when the northern hemisphere is having winter in the summer, in the southern hemisphere, they're having summer and vice versa. Those, excuse me, can certainly influence um, the ways again that those countries meet their citizens' needs, and can also drive the kinds of products and services that they would trade with other nations. As an example, I mentioned to you guys in the first day of this class that I spent just a short amount of time in both the country of Haiti and also Brazil. And obviously, climates are, particularly in Brazil around the Manaus River, or excuse me, Manaus on the Amazon River, extremely different. Um, Certainly culture and environment and climate than what we would see as an example in central Kentucky. Very different flora and fauna. Uh, Obviously, different language in Brazil. They speak Portuguese. In Haiti, they speak a derivative of French. And so all of those different elements have to be accounted for when, for example, a U.S. company is doing trade in those countries. This is interesting here when we think about climate and then topography, and we combine it with uh, sort of the so-called man's inhumanity to man over the years, with wars between countries or even within countries, civil war, environmental policies, natural disasters, and so on. That it's sort of begets the statement that um, depending on how you look at it, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. Um, there's certainly truth in that. It made me think about and folding in our faith component that it's interesting. Jesus is quoted in John 12:8. You will always have the poor among you, but you will not always have me. Um, So it's interesting that 2,000 years ago, this notion of there are a certain percentage of the population in any given country or region will be poor for a variety of reasons. They may be man-made reasons. They may be um, a combination of man-made and non-man-made. Might be self-care, self-management, a variety of different uh, reasons. But that being said, there is sort of this obligation, I would say, that over the last 100 years, that the quote developed world, say Western Europe, the U.S., Canada, um, Australia, I would say, um, and approaching in some of the Eastern European countries, that there is this notion of, hey, the world is not fair, and wealthier countries they do have some obligation at some level to help those countries and those cultures and regions that are less abundant in resources than the more developed countries. And so we're going to talk about that here um, in the next few minutes. Um, Here we can certainly recognize that this notion of environmental protection is not optional. I think we can make an argument for the Christian perspective on this. We can look at the first chapter in Genesis, that God made the world and he said it was good. And here in Genesis 1:28, God blessed them, meaning Adam and Eve, and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the sky, excuse me, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground. So, because God made the world and he called it good, that we have an obligation, I certainly believe, to take care of the world. Now, meaning the environment. Now, how that's defined, and that is certainly up to interpretation. I would say at the extreme, the U.S. in particular has done over, not originally, but over the last 100 years, has done a good job of controlling or managing what are economists call negative externalities. So, for example, companies maybe 100 years ago, 120 years ago, would be manufacturing products and they would have waste that would be a byproduct of those of that manufacture, and there was no regulation for companies to dispose of that waste in a I would say a responsible manner. And so they would dump their waste into lakes and rivers and oceans. And obviously, that's not good. And so there, over the last, I'd say 50, 60 years in particular, a lot of U.S. federal government regulations to control those next negative externalities and put the onus on those companies to build the proper disposal of that waste into their overall cost model. All right. As we were talking about before, different countries have different um, allocations, if you will, or blessing from God, different natural resources. And within that, um, what are some of the resources that we as humans, by God, have been given the responsibility to manage animals and plants in the land, but there are additional resources here that we would say, of course, animals, so we can think about livestock, husbandry, obviously wood for fire and construction, fossil fuels, so we have gasoline, oil, coal. Again, very controversial topics, I guess, nowadays, but um, over the last 200 years, we've been able to use these kinds of natural resources to um, to power technology that we enjoy in 2026. I talked about Greenland earlier. Again, I'm not going to take the time in this recorded lecture to show this video. It is in it is in this slide deck, and the slides will be posted in Discovery. But I would encourage you to watch this video. Again, remember, history is subjective, and even quote unquote journalists, I would argue, have bias and they have subjective lenses that they use to observe the world. But that being said, this is one perspective on trying to describe and maybe even explain the why behind why the U.S. is keenly focused on the control of Greenland, which is currently I guess we would call it sort of a protectorate of Denmark in Western Europe. And so there's been quite a bit of discussion about should the U.S. buy Greenland and is that okay? Is that ethical? Lots of discussion. So I would encourage you to watch that video. This is an interesting chart. It basically says that, if we look back to 1970, most of our energy was provided from oil and coal and gas and a little bit of hydropower. We could look at, for example, the Hoover Dam um, in Nevada. But as we move forward in time, what you do see is the emergence of some nuclear power, this sort of, I don't know, orange color, I would say. Um, and the prediction is that more and more uh, energy will be provided um, by not only nuclear, but also by water powered. So you'll see, for example, I think it was fairly recently in the popular press that 3 Mile Island, which is a nuclear power plant in the middle of Pennsylvania, is getting sort of a refresh and will start generating power um, in the not too distant future. Again, from history class, you probably had read and studied about in 40, 50 years ago, 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant had an accident, a breach, and the result is that radioactivity, similar to what happened in Chernobyl, if you read about that in Russia in the 1980s, and certainly a very a clear manifestation of radiation poisoning um, in Japan, in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. So all that to say, nuclear power is, as I understand it, and I believe, is good power and clean power, and it is an underutilized resource. Um, but it has to be obviously managed very, very carefully. And there have been incidences where that has not been the case. One of the interesting debates that happens in sort of the global dialogue is that the U.S. has historically had a lot of environmental restrictions that have been imposed upon U.S. manufacturing companies. And I'm not saying that was by any means the wrong thing to do, but for whatever set of reasons, many in the rest of the world and other leaders in other countries sort of turn a blind eye to China, which has a notorious record of horrible environmental abuses, and there's historically not been much, if any, government regulations within China to force Chinese companies to deal responsibly with the environment. And so there are quite a few discussions around sort of evening the playing field where Chinese companies have to abide by the same environmental regulations that U.S. companies do. So interesting, a lot of interesting things to research there. Another big trend is global population. Currently, it's about 8 billion people that live in the world. According to this text writer, the projection by 2050 and 25 years will be close to 10 billion. What is problematic or challenging is maybe a better way to say it. Almost all the growth will occur in underdeveloped regions. So one could argue, going back to this sort of axiom or assertion, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. If for a variety of reasons, poorer countries um, populations grow at an extraordinary rate relative to developed countries, then that chasm between the haves and the have-nots, it can be argued, is going to grow wider and wider and wider. And that coupled with the fact that well, let me go back. That coupled with the fact, and we'll talk about this in a couple of slides here, is the developed world, we'd say US, Canada, Western Europe, for example, Australia, um, has had almost little to no population growth, meaning more people are dying than more people are being born for a variety of reasons, some quite controversial that we won't get into in this lecture. But that being said, that is a bit of a problem. And so some of you may have seen and read that there is resurgence, particularly among the youth, because the youth can have younger married couples can have babies that instead of having just one baby, of course, we know the Roman Catholic tradition is they take multiply very seriously. I'm not saying that's bad, but we probably all know of devout practicing Roman Catholic families that have five, six, seven, eight kids. I think it's beautiful. I think it's great, and is going to be needed because the developed world is going to be, I would argue, looked more and more to providing resources and services to lesser developed countries more and more. And so we have to have, at a macro level, more and more people in our Western, quote unquote, Western civilized countries to be able to meet those demands. Okay. Here, the text writer argues that 1.2 billion jobs need to be created to accommodate this growth from 8 to 10 billion. I don't know if that number is right, but what we do know is that with the broad diffusion of artificial intelligence, that the labor market, certainly in the US, and I would say, of course, in the developed world, is faced with a lot of transition. Jobs that were, available 10 years ago no longer exist. And I think I've actually heard Dr. Brown from Chapel talk about in other settings that um, many of you who will graduate soon will change jobs many times throughout your career and probably change into jobs that currently no longer exist. So just a little plug for the Dayton School of Business and the benefits of a premier business school being housed within a Christian liberal arts university is that hopefully, because of this liberal arts component of your higher education experience, that it will allow you to adapt and in an agile way move from job to job and even career to career because you're able to solve problems and look at situations from different perspectives and have the imagination and the creativity to meet those challenges. Here you can see the breakdown in where this 10 billion predicted 10 billion is going to reside. Of course, here at the world level, 8 to 10, but then we can see almost a doubling in Africa, not so, about 1.5 in 1.5x in Asia. Here, look at Europe, right? We see actually population decline projected for the reasons we were just talking about. Latin America, we see growth. North America, some growth. Certainly relative to Europe, that seems to be promising. All right, so um, one of the challenges at a global level is, for example, what is the US's role in helping manage this population growth? Um, I would say, certainly um, education, education for women, which I put a little asterisk there. Um, those countries that are non-secular theocracy, Muslim countries, they don't treat women very well, and they certainly are not going to allow women to get educated. I would point to Exhibit A, Iran used to be a flourishing country, particularly from women. Now, not at all. So, putting that little plug in there. Um, so what can we in the developed world do? Um, you know, education, access to healthcare, access to family planning, right? Again, controversial topic, one might argue, but um, in the mid 20th century, women in the Western world and having access to birth control, that is has cultural components and obviously medical components, but educating and training people in lesser developed countries to say, you don't have to have 10, 12 kids. I mean, you can if the Lord blesses you, but there are ways for, at a macro level, countries can curb that uh, exponential growth in population in a way that will allow societies within those lesser developed countries to flourish in a better way than they would if they had no access to education, healthcare, and birth control, for example. All right. As we were just talking about, obviously, religion and culture influence this notion of family planning. Um, this Roman Catholic tradition we talked about. I would go back here. So, in the Muslim tradition, they do favor large families, so they are growing the population. But as I said, particularly in theocratic countries like Iran currently, for example, not a lot of regard to equal rights for women in those countries. So just an asterisk there that you might want to keep in mind. All right. One thing here that's pretty interesting. Of course, most of the population growth seems to happen in urban areas. It's sort of, I would argue, a blessing and a curse. The blessing is if you're in a major city as opposed to being in a very rural part of a lesser developed country, the chances of you being geographically located closer to good healthcare is much higher. However, you're competing with millions and millions of other people to get access to that same finite amount of healthcare. So here you can see, if the growth occurs in urban areas, um, in many cases, the infrastructure within those urban areas are not able to keep up with the demands of um, exponential population growth within those urban areas, right? Here we were talking a little bit before this population decline, variety of reasons that we could point to for that in the developed worlds. Um, Certainly in China, it's not listed here. China for decades has had a one-child uh, maximum limit for families in China. Um, and so it's sort of interesting that the most populous country in the world is going to have problems because their repopulation of their country is going to be hit severely, is already being affected severely because of this one-child policy in China. As we looked at on an earlier slide, birth rates in Europe and Japan have been had been declining, and so this is a concern, um, and particularly in again in the Western world, um, what incentives are there from I'm saying from a secular perspective, or child tax credits, married families that have children to be able to have tax deductions associated with child care and some of those other expenses that are associated with having children and caring for and raising children. This is interesting as well, sort of at a macro level, a blessing, and you might say well, both at a macro and a micro level, uh, longer lifespans is a blessing and a curse. You might argue the blessing is you as an individual get to live longer. The curse is, again, particularly if we look at healthcare, there's only so much healthcare to go around. And most of the healthcare expenses in an individual's life are associated with their last 10 years of life. And so, for example, I believe it's fairly recently, Canada has, how to say it, they are encouraging from a government policy perspective for older Canadian people to um, uh, engage in assisted suicide healthcare, which is interesting, assisted suicide healthcare. But the idea is that, hey, we can't take care of all these old people. And so if some old people want to unlive themselves, that's okay, and we would encourage that, which is again a very dark view, but just recognizing that that is sort of a cultural, political outgrowth of this phenomenon, which is people are living longer. Um, Here you can see where is this growth happening from 65 to 84, a 3x increase, 85 and older, a 6x increase, right? And over 100, a 16x increase. So again, as people live longer, their healthcare expenses go up. Um, and so it puts strains on a country's and the global infrastructure. And so it becomes an ethical question ultimately. Here are some interesting slides in the more developed world, the breakdown in age on the y-axis and then male and female. And, you know, we might expect sort of a mirror image of male and female. Here, hey, ladies, here, you know, look at this. You definitely outlive men in the main. And so that's reflected here with this with this lower red, pink color going up into the hundreds, much more so than men. In the less developed world, you can see this pyramid shift way down, right? Because of the reasons we talked about, limited access to healthcare, um, education, and so on. Japan is interesting for those of you that are interested in studying Japan for your country selection. Um, you can see that in 1950, there was sort of this pyramid, and now there's sort of an inverted pyramid. So interesting, right? A lot of, or at least this is a projection in 2055. There's you know, what are the Japanese doing? You know, what do they eat? You know, what are their lifestyles such that they tend to live longer than sort of the normal shape in the less developed world and even in the more developed world. So, um, immigration, of course, in the U.S. is a very hot topic. Um, I, you know, here if we look at this slide, um, in many industries there is a shortage of workers. That's certainly an argument for more immigration. Um, Again, this becomes a sort of a political debate. Should those countries, should those jobs go to citizens of the importing country, or should those jobs go to other uh, citizens of other countries that some would argue are jobs that, in the case of the United States, those are jobs that Americans won't do. Um, Pretty interesting argument on both sides. Um, but suffice it to say that when we look at human resources relative to trade and products and services, you know, the importing of immigrants from other countries becomes, uh, you know, an interesting political and cultural phenomenon. Here, as we were referencing a little bit earlier, um, China's population is falling, and largely because of this, you know, one-child mandate that the Chinese Communist government had imposed decades ago. And so it's interesting that the most populous country is actually facing a population decline that um, one could argue is presenting some problems. The distribution of the population here in when this slide was built 2020, I think what's most interesting to look at, right, is this gray 60 and older, um, going from this is at the world level, going from 14 to 21 to 28, right? Now look at what's happening to younger people, 25, excuse me, 25, 21, and 17. And then this middle, 15 to 59, right? 61, 57, 54. So you can see there is a resource challenge and a productivity challenge. Um, and back as we've been saying throughout this lecture, the haves and the have-nots, that the strain on that chasm between the haves and the have-nots at the global level is going to get wider and wider and wider. And so that becomes a controversial topic at the national level as well as at the global level. Now, switching gears, looking at trade routes, how do we move products from one country to another? Um, of course, this trade has some, I guess, what you might call cross-pollination benefits. So it's really cool to be able to eat, for example, in Lexington, Kentucky, authentic Thai food. That's pretty cool, right? So it's neat that trade allows us wherever we live, oftentimes to experience different cultures. Of course, it doesn't really replace going to another country and being immersed in that other country's culture. But we certainly get sort of a sense of what is the cuisine for different countries and cultures. Um, and I think, from a food standpoint, that's pretty cool. So, lots of other things that trade allows will be global trade allows. And so we will be talking about that obviously throughout this semester. Here within Central America, we can appreciate um, the importance of for example, the Panama Canal, which is right here, and being able to move product right from the Atlantic to the Pacific instead of going all the way down to the bottom of South America and then going all the way back up. Central America up into, in the case of the US, up to the US or Canada, the importance of speeding up global trade between the Atlantic and Pacific was significantly enhanced by the development of the Panama Canal close to 120 years ago. All right, here we go. There we go. All right. So, what's interesting um, to me when I look at this slide, obviously for centuries, if you needed to move products from one place to another, you would do that by foot. Maybe it was through horses or camels, or, that was sort of the state of the art of transportation then. Eventually, became oceans and the seas. And then what's interesting to me is that, of course, here in the last 100 and 120 years, um, which, relative to thousands of years, in just the last century, we can move stuff and people by airplane. Hard to believe 120 years ago that didn't exist. And then the internet here in the last 30 years that now, of course, we can buy and sell products and services. The product delivery we can't, necessarily magically have happen over a network. Services certainly can be delivered over the internet, but we can, of course, clear transactions over the web and have, obviously, Exhibit A is Amazon, where you can place an order and then the physical distribution world is able to ship the purchased product from wherever the product is made to your doorstep, right? So here in the last 100 years, this ability to drive global, facilitate global trade has expanded tremendously, which is great. Because if we go back a few slides, remember the population is growing and growing and growing. So how are we going to, let me go back here. So how are we going to meet this increased demand in population? Let me actually, sorry, there's a couple more slides back. How are we going to meet this increase in global population? Well, technology can facilitate the movement of goods from where they're being produced to where they're being consumed, right? All right, let's go back up to where we were. All right. So obviously, with the advent of technology, we've seen this wonderful advancement in communication. The telegraph, of course, in the mid 1800s, U.S. Uh, uh, President Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln, Republican president during the Civil War, he was able to communicate with his U.S. Army, the Union Army, in the field by telegraph. Okay. That was obviously a really big deal for President Lincoln to be able to communicate from Washington, D.C. to, let's say, Ulysses Grant, General Grant in Vicksburg, Mississippi, to get updates on how was the war campaign going on. Of course, we migrated to the telephone, landline for decades, right, until the last 40 years when we have cell phones, TV, computer, mobile phones here, satellite, and then, of course, the web. And so, because of this advancement in technological ability to communicate, it certainly has facilitated global trade in a way that uh, probably if you were born in the year 2000 is probably hard to appreciate. But me pushing 60 years old, I can certainly have observed how technology has made doing business worldwide a lot easier, which is cool. Of course, SpaceX, you guys are probably have at least some awareness of Musk's company, SpaceX. Um, um, the notion of what SpaceX is doing, if you can look on the web and look at a graphic of similar to this graphic here of the globe, but even more so, the number of satellites that are in low orbit around the globe is unbelievable. And we mentioned Iran a little bit earlier. SpaceLink, um, thankfully, is allowing people that have access to technology in Iran. Here of late, there have been some civil uprisings. And again, the theocratic Muslim government in Iran has basically cut off, is to the extent that they could, communication to the outside world. But SpaceLink, and I don't pretend to understand the technology, but somehow SpaceLink is able to get images and updates of these civil uprisings in Iran out to the rest of the world. So personally, I'm very thankful for that. All right. In summary, um, of course, going up to the highest level, international marketing, we have to recognize that there are many different components that drive culture and perceptions and attitudes within a given culture in a country. And because of that, we have to understand those as best we can and to modify and work within those constraints of those attitudes and people that are buying and selling goods and services from us who live in those cultures. Here I highlighted, obviously in red and yellow, um, better understood, peculiarities of a country are better understood and anticipated if its history and geography are studied more closely. Um, I'm just suggesting that, if you have had, and I'm sure all of you had, if you grew up in the U.S., you had U.S. history courses in high school and, Western Civ courses and maybe, different regions outside of Western civilization history courses. Um, no offense to historians, but um, you know, when I was your age, I didn't think a whole lot about history. I just thought it was an extremely dry and boring topic. And 40 years later, I can tell you that history, when it's presented properly and put in context, in the case of doing business outside of your domestic economy, is really interesting and really important and can give you, from a marketing perspective, an advantage because you know how to navigate sort of the soft skills subtleties that are um, certainly at some level very important in different cultures. The next thing I highlighted here, the study of history and geography is needed to provide the marketer with an understanding of why a country has developed as it has. Okay, so again, this is an opportunity for many, if not most of us that grew up in the US to pause and to learn about and consider and appreciate in a charitable manner other countries' cultures so that we can do a good job of marketing to them, understanding their needs, and connecting with them in a profound way. If we think about our those of you that had me for Principles of Marketing, our fifth P of marketing, which is purpose, the more that we can understand different people, groups, and different cultures, hopefully the more successful we will be to expanding the kingdom of God. So, all right, wonderful. Thank you so much again for being flexible, watching this recorded lecture, and I look forward to receiving all of your country selections and seeing you face to face on Thursday. Thank you very much.